Hey, how you doing? This is Chris, and welcome back to the Classic-Gaming Webcast. An Atari 2600 cartridge called the Supercharger was sold in 1982 and 83 by a company called Arcadia, which was renamed Starpath pretty quickly due to conflicts with Emerson regarding its Arcadia console, I'd imagine. The cartridge didn't contain a game, but its cord enabled it to be plugged into the headphone jack, or the earphone jack, I guess, of any tape player, and the games were sold on cassettes. All of this allowed for more RAM than was normally accessible on the console, more varied levels due to the multi-load games on the tapes, and graphics with greater resolution. But the fragility of a cassette tape led to relatively few pieces of software surviving into the 90s, so a little company called Cyberpunks released a collection of Supercharger games in 1996 called Stella Gets a New Brain, named after the Atari designer's nickname for the 2600's CPU. This CD, a second version of which was released in '99, played the sound files because the Supercharger worked a lot like a modem in that it read rapid, high-pitched signals. So with Stella Gets a New Brain, these could be played from any CD player's headphone jack into the Supercharger, so you still needed the console and the cartridge for this to work. The disc could also be read by a PC drive as it contained a lot of bonus stuff. Starpath merged with Epix later in 1983. My buddy Adam Trianfo, whom I've known since 1986, had Stella Gets a New Brain, and we played a few games back in the late 90s. I never had the CD, or for that matter an actual Supercharger. I did buy an Activision release for the Commodore 64 in 1985. The program had just come out, and I had salivated over ads about the program before saving up enough money to buy it, because there were pictures of ice cream in the ads. No, I just really wanted it. I had wanted to write my own games since pretty much the first week during which I had ever played video games, but by '85, at the ripe old age of 13, I had found BASIC to be too slow a language to be good for pretty much anything except games involving words, basically. Basically, nice one. BASIC is, of course, a slightly altered acronym for Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code. But I guess BAPSIC didn't make much sense. Anyway, this program I saved up for was called Garry Kitchen's GameMaker, created by David Crane, of course. This was a handful of utilities located separately from one another, such as Sprite Maker, Sound Maker, and so on. And the files that you created with these utilities could be used in the editor, the part of GameMaker in which you actually wrote your program, incorporating your sprite files, etc. when you wanted. And you really needed to know how to program. I had been writing in BASIC for a few years by then, and everything that I had learned through experience, every trick, method, application of loops, optimal sequence of joystick checks, etc., came into play when I wrote my first programs in the GameMaker editor. I even had to read a bit about how machine language works to understand it all. Never mind that the commands are selected by pointing and clicking, well, firing, since you use a joystick, of course. All of the actual variables, values, screen coordinates, speeds, colors, etc. still have to be entered after you've selected each general command, which basically condenses a few complicated commands into a single, more understandable one, to save space and hardcore studying. It's no construction set, that's for sure. As with any computer language, it's not going to do anything you haven't precisely told it to do. It's ultimately like a very advanced BASIC, but any game you write runs at machine language speed. I was discouraged at first anyway. My first couple of tries didn't pan out well. I had expected it to be easy, but you really have to learn how to program effectively from other languages or other reading materials than the very skeletal GameMaker manual. But I got the hang of it eventually. My first few games were very funny, even when they weren't supposed to be. I did have a game in which the player's Galaga-type cannon shot cartoony likenesses of my least favorite 7th grade teachers called Weird Whereabouts. I thought that was so clever. And a simpler Elite-type spaceship game with sector maps and the windshield shoot-'em-up part called Starfish. I had a submarine game named after a song by The Cult called Electric Ocean. Oh, I had a bunch of them that I don't have anymore. In addition to Sprite Maker and Sound Maker, there are Scene Maker for your backgrounds, and Music Maker if you wish. It didn't really take advantage of the 64's SID chip, however. This is odd, as Sound Maker is really good. You can play around with one sound effect for days if you get carried away. My GameMaker disc somehow became corrupted in the late 90s until Adam found me another original floppy disk in the box and everything. In the early and mid-90s, I wrote articles about old video games and computer games, which had just started to be called classic. I had just kept playing them all the way through, so I thought, oh, they're classic now, alright. And I saved these articles on floppy disks, having written them on the C64 as sequential files. I did this for my own enjoyment. I didn't know anyone else was doing any such thing. I thought it was probably weird, but I didn't care. It was fun for me. I had no idea about newsletters that focused on old games, zines as they're called, or the budding websites, mostly on GeoCities, if you remember that. I didn't have access to this new thing called the internet. I had messed around on CompuServe and local bulletin boards in the 80s, and even wrote a little program that opened the modem port for real-time access. This would later be called chatting, which amused me when it happened, but I hadn't remained involved in that sort of thing. When Adam and I started hanging out again in 96 or 97, after about 10 years of not having seen each other, we were surprised to find that we both still liked old games, and I was especially impressed with a newsletter that he wrote and sent out on actual paper, kids, called Orphaned Computers and Game Systems. His was one of the very first, as he had started it in 94. It had been quite a while since his most recent issue, so I encouraged him to start it back up, and he asked if I'd write a few things for it if he did so, and it went on from there. You can see the website that it eventually became at orphanedgames.com. So Adam and I obviously started playing games together, and in fact attempting to write them on the Commodore Amiga. And we decided to go to the World of Atari 98 convention in Vegas just to see what that was all about. We went to another convention in 2003, the CGE, I think. Anyway, back in the 90s, he wasn't crazy about the fact that all I had were my old Atari 2600 and Commodore 64, which finally died around that time. So he found me a replacement at Goodwill. So he lent me the Amiga 600 so that I could learn all about it. And then he put together an Amiga 2500 for me. Incidentally, this finally allowed me to get into seriously composing orchestral music, as he also gave me Deluxe Music Construction Set by Electronic Arts. He figured I'd be interested in it. They sounded like real instruments, and the screen was basically blank music notation paper where you could place your notes with the mouse, like a lot of modern composing programs, of course. I was smitten. I also made cartoons on the computer. Oh, I rated the Amiga much more highly than any Microsoft-driven box. Now, Adam was a collector, and at the end of 1997, he responded to my holiday cynicism in his characteristic way, a combination of smartassness and generosity. He gave me his doubles. After coming home very early one December morning from my graveyard shift at work, I found, stacked up against my door, a ColecoVision, a Nintendo Entertainment System, an Atari 8-bit called the XE130, an Atari 5200 in the case with two controllers he had sent away to be refurbished, an Atari 7800, a bunch of software for each of these, a binder full of real manuals. I was floored, of course. So I didn't leave the house for a year. When I bought a bargain Atari Jaguar because I wanted to see what Tempest 2000 was like, I bought it for the classic Tempest included on the cartridge, to be honest. Adam lent me the Doom cartridge, on which I got absolutely hooked, along with Cybermorph, leading to my purchase of a PlayStation 1 with a tax refund check so that I could play more Doom levels, and a few years later the purchase of a PS2 so I could play more Doom-type games. By the present, of course, I'm into designing my own WAD files, but this was a guy who swore he would never buy new systems, as I didn't like how many modern games were just like each other, nor the ridiculous prices of new software. I'm a loner, in spite of the unfortunately negative connotations that term has in this extrovert-biased culture. I'm confident enough to be comfortable in my own company. How about that? And I tend to be what others call old-fashioned. I don't have a cell phone, for instance, or anything like that. Don't need it, that's all. Most things that I really like to do indicate solitude, except perhaps when I've made the mistake of trying to live with a girlfriend on occasion. And I'm not really comfortable around a bunch of people, unless I'm the center of attention. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but I've heard that it's common with introverts. Damn it, something about me is common. Must change that. Anyway, bringing all of these apparently separate topics together, in 1999, I moved back to Buffalo, New York, where I'm from, for a couple of years to see what playing rock music would be like out there, and in nearby Toronto, Canada. It so happened that around that time, Adam had left Albuquerque temporarily as well, moving all around the States with his family for various reasons. For his birthday, I would send him games I had made that were more like comedies for those who really got them than actual games. I made these pseudo games with GameMaker and sent them to Adam on floppy disks. Except for a text adventure, a takeoff on Zork written in Atari BASIC called Fork, the Great Underground Dining Room. That was tougher to write than I had expected, as there are no dynamic string variables in Atari BASIC. I realized this when I got around to writing the parser routine. Had I known that, I would have just done it on the C64. One of the GameMaker-based programs, sent to Adam in 2000, was the result of wondering what it would be like if the Atari 2600 became confused or had a bunch of cartridges stuck into it at once somehow. I merged certain games with others, trying to replicate the graphics and sounds as closely as possible, and of course trying to make it all funny. I wanted to call it Stella something, based on the CPU, the Central Processing Unit, and then I remembered the title Stella Gets a New Brain, so my send-up title was Stella Gets a Lobotomy. This is the basic loader that I wrote. I'm all about title screens using keyboard graphics, man. Too cool. Flatteringly enough, as of a couple of years now, I think, each new release of GameBase, the widely preferred front end for Commodore emulation at the least, has contained a few of my games, which was surprising, and I took it as a compliment. At least the designation is always made that I used GameMaker to write the games, as any executable file that you told GameMaker to create on the floppy disk automatically started with the assurance that Garry Kitchen had something to do with this game, whether he liked it or not, depending on how your game turned out. So I'll show you Stella Gets a Lobotomy. If this seems conceited, I don't mean it that way. I just wanted to share with all my new online pals something I created to crack up my best pal a number of years ago. This first part is just an opening, as it has more to do with the arcade version of Asteroids, obviously. The joke about the music in Asteroids, sounding like the Jaws theme, had to finally be made by someone, you know? Yes, these little sketches are all interactive. You can control the ship here, for instance, and even use hyperspace. Cute, huh? So now we get into the lobotomized Atari VCS. Looks like Pitfall, doesn't it? So what if Pitfall Harry found himself lost in a combat cartridge? Well, he's not afraid. He takes things like they're treasures. That's what he does. And the score goes up, depending on which tank he grabs. Then there's nothing left. Combat is vacant. Nothing dangerous in here, and Harry's all about adventure, so check out the other direction. The chalice from Adventure, of course. The Pitfall death song gets played when Yorgel swallows him, and then Harry's stuck in his stomach, just like the Adventure cursor. Bowling is especially fun when you're in the chopper from Chopper Command. The joke here, of course, is that it doesn't matter if you bother to aim. Now that's my kind of bowling. That's what the bowling guy does when he gets a strike, of course. I split this whole thing into two files, as you can only have two high-res background scenes in a single GameMaker executable, which is definitely one of its shortcomings, along with no ability to scroll the backgrounds. This is paced to be a funny little surprise. Instead of a snow speeder, we find the Atari VCS incarnation of Pac-Man having to face a deadly Imperial Walker from The Empire Strikes Back. With all of his chewing, even when there's nothing to chew, just as in the actual 2600 game, I spent the most amount of time getting that Walker to look like it does in the real Empire game. If you get damaged, you can land for repairs, as in the real game. And if you get wiped out entirely, you get the Pac-Man death. He wilts. He can't fire. It all seems insurmountable, doesn't it? Well, what does Pac-Man do? He eats. So, moving off the screen, we find poor E.T. stuck at the top of the starting cliff in Jungle Hunt. The reason this was supposed to be funny was that for all his neck-extending powers, he's really useless when it comes to jumping. Finally, we have Skydiver, that game that we've all tried seriously once. But it's endlessly funny to me to play the real game wrongly, as it were, just shoving the poor guy out of the airplane over and over without opening his parachute. And watching the funny lethal landing animation, so I included that here, even though it takes 4 days for him to get down there in my very forgiving version. But if you do open the parachute, see, it had to take forever here, or the timing at the end just wouldn't have been as sardonically funny, I suppose. It looks like you're gonna make it. Until, of course, the command ship from Space Invaders puts an end to all that. So there's Stella Gets a Lobotomy. Another not quite real game that I made around that time is called Super Space Carnage. A suspiciously generic and exciting title, or at least a good parody of one, so you know I'm up to something. Looks pretty straightforward, right?
The alien that you shot down was taken to the hospital at 1:30. Your projectile went through his right thigh and lodged in his spleen. At 10 before the hour, he was pronounced dead due to major internal hemorrhaging. Services for the alien, whose colleagues have been quoted as calling a really decent guy and fun to know, will commence at noon tomorrow. You video maniacs are all alike. You just blast everyone who looks a little different from you without thinking. Well, we hope you're satisfied.
The truly funny bit to me is that it just goes back to the violent-looking title screen, as if you're about to have all sorts of fun kicking ass in space. I did make some actual games as well. There's one in here called Tyrant from '98 that I'm not crazy about anymore. The balance isn't quite there. There's some Tron influence in it, but it's not much fun. But the one that is still pretty fun, in as much as I can play it at all objectively, is entitled Jupiter's Electrician. Also from '98. This is the only game I ever made with GameMaker that I still like that's in GameBase. I made these all on the original hardware. I didn't have any emulators until the mid-2000s. One thing I've noticed about all of my games, looking back, even the lackluster ones that thankfully aren't in GameBase, is that you're never protecting or rescuing anyone. You're responsible only for yourself. You're always on your own. There's no love in video games. Oh, sure, there might be hearts. Donkey Kong, Popeye, Microsurgeon, and so forth. The 9 atmosphere-depleting space stations, or broken Easter eggs, maybe, must be shorted out. They're live. You can fry a sidewalk on these eggs. If you don't do that, their creator will wind up taking over the universe or something. I can't quite remember the funny docs I wrote, but it's always something like that, isn't it? The stations have built-in defenses in the forms of missiles that are launched at you, more and more at once as the waves go on, and you see them rotating and from the head-on perspective. Since I didn't want the usual generic missile graphics, You shoot these missiles, and all of this explosive activity eventually wipes out the very stations that have been firing them at you. Until the next wave, of course. The novel thing is that you only have 3 projectiles, so you have to race across the screen and catch the one you've just fired before it leaves altogether. Or you're down to 2, etc. You can keep track by looking at where it says shots at the top there. When you run out of them, you're done. That's it. The good news is that when you complete a wave, you get 3 fresh ones again, even if you were just down to 1, for instance, when you beat the last wave. You also have 4 lives, or staplers, or little croquet nets, or whatever the hell you're supposed to be controlling. Oh, connectors. Interesting choice. Now, in terms of having to catch what you've just fired after it takes out what you fired it at, I hadn't known that Quadrun, one of the few Atari 2600 games available only through the Atari fan club in the 80s, has a similar retrieve your own fired thing motif. I had never played that rare game, or of course read about how to play it, so I thought this was an entirely original idea. You have to complete a wave by taking out 12 missiles before all of the space stations have that lit up electrical charge around them, but that's very easy to do, so I guess I just wanted to add an extra way to goad the player into quick action, instead of just indefinitely dodging everything. If you catch the random atmospheric upheaval, which looks appropriately enough like a lightning bolt, then you're invulnerable for a few seconds. That's the wave number in the lower right corner there. Since I don't like it in games when there's no indication of how far you've gotten, I dug the idea in 2600 Missile Command that the screen should change colors to keep the eye refreshed over long games, but I chose a rather garish color combination when trying to get something similar here in the sky above Jupiter. I meant well. Hey, war isn't supposed to be comfortable. The missiles get faster and faster with each wave, as you might imagine. Not a bad difficulty curve. Had GameMaker allowed for more memory, I would have added more game-changing twists later on than the lightning bolt. But anyway, there's Jupiter's electrician. Let's finish things up with the usual piss-taking, as I was thinking yesterday about how little I've bothered throughout my life to play the tedious, but accidentally funny, Congo Bongo, Sega's semi-isometric attempt at ripping off Crazy Climber and Donkey Kong that simply doesn't work, especially in its Atari 2600 conversion, I think. Also by Sega, of course. I borrowed the game in the 80s, couldn't stand it, and haven't really played it since then, and I wanted to remember why. So let's see. This game is apparently what happens when someone tries to combine Donkey Kong and Zaxxon. It's hard to tell if a coconut, or maybe oyster, is about to hit you or not. Rather than original, the mechanics are simply cumbersome. And that so-called music. 2 notes, repeating over and over and over. Couldn't they have just gone without it? At least you hear a different little tune when you get your guy killed. Makes you want to walk the poor bastard off a cliff just to give your ears a break. There are these monkeys, and they're supposed to gang up on you and throw you into the waterfall, which, here, is evidently sick of its original home and surround. Whether or not there's good gameplay doesn't necessarily have to do with graphical detail, of course. Unfortunately, this game has neither. But one of the monkeys here just attaches himself to you and makes it hard to jump until you shake him off. He doesn't seem as concerned with killing you as with wanting to be your pet. The arcade monkeys would look at their home counterparts and throw themselves off the cliff in shame. This game moves like a flip-it cartoon book with every 3rd page torn out. It's like watching a movie on a projector that has chewing gum stuck in the gears. This was surely a waste of money, even back then. The game could easily be emulated by smashing yourself in the head with a clothing iron a few times. And now you get to play a very awkward version of Frogger's top half. Again, doesn't work. Mainly because he often doesn't jump in the direction you have him pointed in. Maybe it's supposed to be an exercise in telekinesis. But since that doesn't exist, and as this part is frustrating as hell, which doesn't mean fun in my book, or even my pamphlet, or any of my brochures, let's move on to something else before I actually start to criticize this game. Fast Eddie, a 20th Century Fox Game of the Century, as they call their 2600 line. Doesn't speak highly of the Century in this case. Some of their other games for the console, however, are among my favorites. such as Flash Gordon, Fantastic Voyage, Beanie Bopper, and Revenge of the Beefsteak Tomatoes. That's a fun game. Give that one a chance. This is a climbing game as well, making this thematic. How tidy. There are versions of this game by Mark Turmel of the Smash TV coin-op on most 8-bit computers as well, by Sirius, but I've hardly ever played any of them, as it's not a very interesting game. We'll remember why in just a moment. That's it, I'll bet. His movement is smooth, but control response isn't anywhere near fluid, making it difficult to do anything precisely, which I'd say would be necessary in a game like this. I think you collect the hearts. Aha, see? Plenty of hearts and no love. I suppose I should ask before taking someone's heart like this. When you have enough, just when you're up to your ears in hearts, the sneaker at the top breaks his own legs in disgrace, and you see that he's wearing a key as a wig. Hey, we don't know about other cultures. Theoretical diagonals are not acknowledged, so you can't just go from running to climbing a ladder in one movement. Once you do start climbing one, you can't climb back down until you reach the top. You can't change your mind halfway. Once you step on that first rung, you're committed. Maybe he was quicker to respond when he was fit. Look at him. Fast Eddie needs to do some sit-ups before he goes running around in alien apartments. And stop eating hearts for a while. And fish that can fly. That can't be good for the digestion. The computer versions are probably easier to control, because it seems like it should be fun, doesn't it? Just jumping around, grabbing flashing presents from the air. By the time Fast Eddie made it to the 2600, he apparently switched from amphetamines to beer, because he just doesn't notice what my controller's doing sometimes. But, I hasten to add, how many VCS games have I written, to be fair? And I'm sure I'd get the hang of this over time. That's what I'm afraid of. So let's quit while our standards are high, shall we? Thank you for watching, and until Eddie gets a lobotomy and remembers that he's supposed to stay on Iron Maiden album covers, this is Chris.